Welcome back to part 3. So we've done, in our first video, we talked about the first 2 steps of scientific method, making an observation and asking a question. In our second one, we focused on variables, the independent variable, the dependent variable, and the control variables. I hope by the time you're watching this section of the video lecture that you have a good understanding of the variables, how they're different, and how they're used in an experiment. So we're going to stick with our diet root beer experiment. We're going to still use that as the example. And today, in this video, we're going to talk about writing a hypothesis, formulating a hypothesis, coming up with a hypothesis, however you want to state it. But it's all about the hypothesis in this video. Okay? So what is a hypothesis? A hypothesis is a possible answer to that question that you came up, that scientific question or problem that you identified. This is where you're going to be saying, hey, I think that this is the answer to that question based on all of my research, my background knowledge, and things that I've discovered. I really think that this is the answer to the question or the solution to the problem. Now, in order for it to be a good scientific hypothesis, it has to be able to be tested. You must be able to test it. If it's just a possible answer to the question and you can't test it, you can't design, plan, and conduct an experiment to see if you're right or wrong, then it's not truly a scientific hypothesis. Okay. Sometimes scientists will call a hypothesis an educated guess. Why educated? Because you are making a guess, but not just a wild guess. You're basing it, remember, on your background knowledge, your experience, the research that you've done, and your curiosity and things that you've observed, okay? So it's not just a wild guess. It truly is an educated guess, and it has to be testable. Testable, very, very important, okay? All right, at KIS, we have selected a certain format for writing a hypothesis. Now, you will see this all the way through high school. So here in 6th grade, we're trying to get you ready for each next step. And so we're going to start by, rather than teaching you the if-then template for writing hypothesis, we're going to talk about the if-then because that's the one that you're going to be using throughout your career here at KIS. All right, so the if-then because statement is just a format or a template that we use for writing a hypothesis. Now, remember, hypothesis is an educated guess of the answer to your question that can be tested. All right, so our example here, let me turn the camera off so that you can see it clearly. All right, so here's the example for the diet root beer experiment. All right, so the first section, the if section of the if, then, because, is that if the type of cooling method affects how cold soda gets, so affects the temperature of the soda, right? So the cooling method, remember, is our independent variable, and the temperature of the soda, how cold the soda gets, that's our dependent variable. So you want to, in the very beginning of this hypothesis, in the if portion, you want to talk about the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. This is what you think, again, what the relationship is. Your hypothesis about this might be different from someone else's. You might think that the freezer is going to be the best cooling method for getting my soda cold and not freezing, and someone else might think it's the ice bath, and someone else, might think something else. But here is where you are stating what you think the relationship is between the independent variable and the dependent variable. So I have written if the type of cooling method, so if that independent variable does in fact affect how cold the soda gets, then, okay, so this is the next portion of the if, then, because. This is the then. So this is where I'm making my prediction. This is where my educated guess comes in. So I've said that in my if portion, I've said there's a relationship between the cooling method and how cold the soda gets. I said there's a relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. So now in the then, this is where I am kind of stepping up to the plate and saying, yes, this is what I think is going to be the best cooling method. So I say, then ice with salt water will cool the soda most efficiently. That means fast and well, right? So we don't say best because best is a very difficult term to define. Best for you might be not best for me, okay? So if the type of cooling method affects how cold soda gets, that's the if portion. That's where I'm talking about the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. Then ice with salt water will cool the soda most efficiently. That is my prediction. That is my educated guess about that relationship in the if portion, okay? Because salt lowers the freezing point of water. Now, this is where my background knowledge and my research really come into play because I'm having to use the science reasoning behind my prediction. I have to give good scientific reasoning to support the then portion of my hypothesis. So I know a little bit about water and temperature. And remember, I want the temperature of my soda to get as low as possible without freezing. And so I think, just based on my background knowledge and the research that I've done about cooling things, that the salt water, because the salt water lowers the freezing point of water, in other words, it has to be colder in order for it to freeze. I think that the ice with salt water is going to be the most efficient method of cooling my soda. Okay, so in the if part, you're talking about what the relationship is between the independent variable and the dependent variable, or that there is a relationship, a cause and effect. In the then portion, this is where you're stating what you think the answer to the question is or solution to the problem is. And the because portion is where you put the science behind it, so that we know when we read your hypothesis that it's not just a wild guess, it's an educated guess. And so it has to be correct science reasoning to support your hypothesis. Okay, the next step is to plan and conduct an experiment or procedure. So I'm going to hold off and do that in a separate video because hypothesis is a little confusing. Okay, so we're going to stop here for today. Our next step will be this one, and we'll probably finish up scientific method in the next video. If not, we'll do a fifth one. Okay, all right, I hope you learned a lot about hypothesis today. And about the writing, we're going to be doing a lot of practice with this in class. So don't worry if you don't understand. You will by the time we're done.